Great. I spend a lot of time worrying about how we learn history and wondering if we're learning it in the right order or if we're learning the right lessons from it. When we think about Black History Month and we learn about the civil rights movement, or when children are learning about it, they oftentimes start with this image in their history books. And Rosa Parks sitting on the bus was really not the beginning of their story, right? There were years and years of people very scared in their homes, meeting together, worried if this movement was going to succeed. There were lots of failures before this. Rosa Parks really marks the beginning of some momentum. When something was starting to go right for this group, it was starting to get bigger. When we talk about the gay rights movement every Pride, or in October, which is Queer History Month, we often start with this image, and similarly, this isn't quite the beginning of the story. There are decades of history before we get to this point in the 70s and before we get to the Castro, where really amazing figures lived to push the boundaries of the society and times that they lived in, and in order to really create what we know as the gay rights movement. So this lecture is asking a couple of questions. How are movements made? How are identities formed? The GLBTQ acronym has gone through many iterations and evolutions over the year. How did gays and lesbians first identify as part of the same team with a common cause, right? Because that was not an assumed thing at the very beginning. And then what happens next? We're seeing big changes in the ways that people like to join together, the ways that they want to build communities. And so looking back at history is such a fascinating way to think about how might this evolve or change in the years ahead. So we start with the beginning here. So San Francisco and the gold rush, 1848, we see a huge wave of people coming to the city. This is what it looks like approximately around 1848, maybe a few years later. And at the height, we were seeing over 1,000 people per week coming to San Francisco, just a tremendous explosion of population here and rapidly built infrastructure. One of those essentials that was being built quickly in San Francisco were saloons, right? You had a lot of people with extra money to spend, maybe gold they'd found or business they'd done with people who'd found that gold. And the entertainment industry in San Francisco, early San Francisco, was absolutely disproportionate to what it should have been, maybe. So an example here is in 1866, for every one place of worship, we had 31 saloons. Now, the saloon isn't a bar. A saloon's much bigger. It usually has a stage, there's entertainment, there's other things going on. So imagine just much bigger places filled with people for every church or house of worship you see. And by 1890, 50 years later, we saw that there was a saloon for every 96 residents, which would make that the highest proportion in the US, more than double that of New York or Chicago, right? So it's a big drinking town, it's a big entertainment town. If we do the math here, the 343 residents that would have been here by 1890 divided by those 96 residents per saloon, we get almost 3,500 saloons in San Francisco in 1890, which, you can definitely take a look at some of the pictures on the wall here to see that San Francisco doesn't seem like it's big enough to sustain that amount of saloons. Here's a good example of what that might have looked like in a couple of cases. Again, a slightly larger space, usually some entertainment involved as well. And a lot of this clustered around North Beach. Why? Because North Beach was, of course, close to the docks, was where a lot of the industry that was based around shipping and moving in and out of the city, the dock workers living here. And so this transient male community that was flocking to the city for work was going home every night and spending their money out at the bars and saloons and whatnot. A great quote from the Pacific in 1892 is, "The city is ruled by saloons no matter whether the Republican or Democratic Party is in power." And so one interesting thing we can see here is when gold miners were coming to San Francisco, they were still interested in keeping up with a lot of their customs and their traditions and dances, right? And one interesting theory is that during this time there was a custom of an overwhelmingly male population, and therefore how do we do the male and female parts of all of our dances? And so a system was devised that the handkerchiefs that many men wore would be worn in certain pockets in order to designate the male or female role in the dance, right? And some people theorize that this eventually led on to hanky code, which existed well on into the 20th century. It's still mostly done in Soma bars and leather bars and whatnot, but now a whole long list of different kinds of kinks and interests can be linked to different colors and styles of handkerchiefs and the pockets they go in. So an interesting time where we might have seen some of the origins of some of early gay culture here. And here's just an example of some of the minors and a modern day handkerchief. Around this time in the 1860s, we have kind of the early definitions of homosexuality. Up until this had been really described as sodomy, and it was described as a deviant behavior. But the writer Karl Heinrich Ulrichs is protesting a new law. This happens in kind of different countries in the Victorian era, where a lot of countries that had sodomy laws and the anti-sodomy laws on the book were reviving them and changing them and updating them. And there was some protest and backlash against this. And so he's trying to redefine it. He says it's not a deviant behavior. There's evidence to suggest that this is the way people are, this is the way they're born, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that was really remarkable language to be using all the way in 1867. And that was starting to enter the zeitgeist of what people were talking about already. A few decades later, we had Oscar Wilde wearing his green carnation in his lapel. This became a fast symbol of dandies all over Europe and in America, who wanted to signal that they were gay, but didn't have any other symbols or ways to kind of overtly share that. We still see today in pop culture different celebrities who pay a nod and an homage to this motif. It's fascinating because there's so much history of different symbols that existed before the rainbow flag, which is now ubiquitous. Also at the time, we had authors talking about homosexuality, describing it as that unspeakable vice of the Greeks. And that is where the name of this tour and talk comes from, is this unspeakable vice that was too hush-hush to even be spoken at the beginning of this 100 years I cover, and by the end has really found its voice. At the time here, it's also important to know that there was all kinds of entertainment, much of it very unsavory by our palates today. This was an extremely racist form of entertainment, minstrel shows. But what's interesting here is we see the early precursors into vaudeville and then eventually drag queens. And so this performance art, which many historians now believe may have been, if we kind of psychoanalyze maybe what was happening in the minds of some of these actors, they're perhaps manifesting a sexual desire of their own, to either be black men or to have black men, perhaps, right? So lots going on under the surface. Here's a great look of Pacific Street, or Terrific Street, all the way back in 1851. And around this time, there was a great quote here: "Pacific Street is the haunt of the low and the vile of every kind, where the petty thief, the house burglar, the tramp, the whoremonger, lewd women, cutthroats, murderers are all found." Sounds like a fun place. And I want to move into the next phase here. So we have this, we have obviously the 1906 earthquake, and what that does for the North Beach area and for the Barbary Coast is it's kind of a restart. Much of it burns down. There's an opportunity to remake some of these spaces or reinvent them, and it's a time to update them to current trends of what kind of entertainment is happening at the moment. One of my favorite bars was The Dash, which somehow earned a very huge title here: San Francisco's most notorious and disreputable establishment, which is quite the title in this town. It was known for having female impersonators who would take patrons into booths by the stage and perform sex acts for $1. And this was in 1908, so this is a new bar after the fire. And it lasted only 6 months. It was so notorious. It ended up being linked to a dirty judge who was propping up the business and was kind of keeping the cops off of it, and eventually a new DA caught up to him, and that was the end of the Dash. An anti-vice pamphlet around that time said, "Inside is a small stage on which a low variety of performance is given. Flanking the stage on either side of the big room are curtained boxes in which are ensconced degenerate female impersonators. The Dash is the home of unspeakable vices." Is our word again. So it's important to know that at this time we start to see vaudeville, right? Entertainment's shifting a little bit, it's evolving. And there's a particular character that becomes popular at the turn of the century here called the prima donna. The prima donna is this haughty dame, but she's also got a really sharp tongue and a really good wit, right? Which should remind you, if you've ever been to a drag show, of pretty much the same persona that any drag queen still persists to this day. And this was being shown to huge audiences that were very mixed. This wasn't considered gay entertainment. This was for all ages and all persuasions to show up and to watch and enjoy. And it took some time, a few decades, for this new art form to transition a bit. Here we see two of the earliest drag superstars, in their time, of course, known more for female impersonation. On the right, we have the poster for Julian Eltinge, who still has a Broadway theater named after him on 42nd Street. And we see a poster for his act where, you know, half male, half female, and it's this illusion that everyone's being drawn to. Now, Julian eventually came to somewhat resent some of the insinuations being made by his show and his illusion, and so he crafted a PR campaign up in the top left here of him doing very masculine things off stage, right? He was very worried that he would be cast as this kind of effeminate person. Contrast that to just a few decades later, in the 20s, we have Bert Savoy in the lower left two pictures. Bert obviously is enjoying the costume and is enjoying any association you might be throwing at him. He created the character, or adopted it at least very famously, called the fop. And the fop is an archetype, a gay archetype, where you see this in film, you see this in theater, where they're extremely effeminate and non-threatening, right? It's a different kind of gay persona that is usually the best friend or the silly character, the sidekick, that no one's too worried about. And Bert really embraced that persona, and it sought it to its advantage, where no one took him too seriously, and he was able to gain a lot of popularity. He traveled all over the country, and it's said that he perhaps inspired Mae West's persona, again, this very witty, biting kind of humor. We also have around this time Polari, which is a gay code language that was becoming increasingly popular. It started over in England. It was used for centuries by Romani and Yiddish, and there's a little bit of Italian influence from traveling festivals, and then eventually a little bit of Cockney thrown in there as well. So it's the soup of all of these different languages that is used almost entirely by theater folk in England. And obviously, homosexuals being in a lot of theater picked it up, started to use it outside of theater, and started to teach other members and add their own words to it. And so around this period in the early 1900s, it wouldn't have been unusual to have heard men speaking right in front of cops or in front of you know, people who would have been too prudish to have heard exactly what they were saying, speak openly in code about who they hooked up with the night before, who's going to be where everyone's going to hang out that night, and they were able to hide some of this. A lot of this vernacular has found our way into the common language. So today the words camp we still use, right? Ostentatiously and extravagantly effeminate. Butch, the opposite almost, markedly aggressive or aggressively masculine. Clutching your pearls, right? And even zhuzh, right, are words that actually all come from Polari and from the gay usage of it frequently through this time period. So I'll teach you a little bit of Polari here. Bonadish filiomi is a translation for nice ass, young man. So by 1900, San Francisco's changed. The census is starting to show that the influx between men and women is balancing out. Although I have heard, someone on my tour just recently said that it's a misnomer or perhaps an exaggeration that the skew of male to female early on was quite so drastic. That part of the numbers being off there is that only married women were counted in some of those censuses. And so anyone who was single or perhaps sex workers in Barbary Coast wouldn't have been counted amongst women. So regardless though, we see by the census, at least those numbers seem to be balancing back out. But where are these people coming from? They're coming from the East Coast. They have more of a puritanical culture. The temperance movement is also becoming popular around this time. And so the anti-vice pressure really starts to mount on the Barbary Coast to change some of its ways. They eventually pushed San Francisco. It was one of the last places to officially outlaw sex work, but they do so in 1917. Largely, this just disperses to other corners of San Francisco, but at least it starts to take away some of the wilder side of what the Barbary Coast is known for. When Prohibition comes, it is unwelcome by San Francisco city leaders. In fact, in 1921, the Board of Supervisors even reprimanded 2 police officers for enforcing the Volstead Act. And so it was well known here that you could, if you wanted liquor, you could find it. And there was varying degrees of how open they would have discussed it if they known it was somehow going to get back to a federal level. But people were quite resistant to it in general. Now, by the end of Prohibition, my research has shown that there was a little bit of response to this. The pressure had started to mount a little bit, and there was at least a little bit of decline in the party scene, or at least its openness here. Ultimately, what that means for us in our story is that there's a shift in the economy of the real estate when it comes to bars here. The saloons we talked about, the 31 for every one place of worship, that starts to transform into bars. And bars are smaller. They can cater to smaller groups of people. And for gay people, that's a good thing, right? Instead of having to go to a bar of 100 people where you never know who's going to try and knock you out for making eyes at someone across the room, you can now go to a smaller club where you know who's going to be there. And this smaller environment is a little safer and helps you form bonds and begin to develop the seeds of culture here. And then as we move into the 40s, 50s, and 60s here, World War II marks a big change nationally, right? And part of this is even by accident. The US military makes an official rule saying that homosexuals cannot be in the military, which kind of forces everyone in the country to suddenly realize that homosexuals is a type of person, not a behavior. That critical key change in language accidentally reveals to people all over that there are more like them, and that they are in such numbers that the US government had to make an official statement about it, right? And so World War II marks several culture shifts all at once, and we'll talk about a few of them here. One building we skipped in the 1850s when we were talking about that was the Montgomery housing block, also known as the Monkey Block. Who knows what building is there today?
Bank of America.
Almost. Transamerica Pyramid, yeah, right. And this building lasted a little over 100 years. Lawrence Ferlinghetti called it the most famous literary and artistic structure in the West. Robert Louis Stevenson went there, Mark Twain went there, and during the 40s and 50s, it was really the cultural hub of a lot of artists and bohemians, as they would have been called. And that also shaped quite a bit of what the bars post-Prohibition were going to start to cater to and focus on. One of the most famous people in those bars nearby was Jose Sarria. Sarria, funnily enough, is the person who I think inspired me most to want to create this tour. His nickname, his performance name was the Nightingale of Montgomery Street. And at the time I started working on this, I lived on Montgomery Street, and I was so shocked there was a famous drag queen named after my street, and I had no idea. Anyway, so Sarria wanted to enlist in the Army after Pearl Harbor, but he was too short. He was a little guy, under 5 foot. And so he did what any gay motivated man would do. He slept with the recruitment officer and was able to enlist. Sarria ended up fighting in several theaters, including the Battle of the Bulge, where he became a lieutenant sergeant, and I think learned quite a bit from the organizing and fighting here. He came back and continued organizing and fighting in a different theater when he got here. When he returned home, Sarria was sadly arrested over at the St. Francis Hotel. It was a well-known cruising spot. Now at this point, gay men there's no apps, there's no Grindr, there's no way to find out who's who, there's not even really open gay bars. And so one of the common ways to meet other gay men was to go to known cruising spots, and the St. Francis Hotel hosted one of these. And he saw a man he knew, who he didn't know, but happened to work for the police force now, and when he went to go make a move, handcuffs went on. At that time, that betrayal was pretty terrible, because it wasn't just an arrest, it wasn't just a fine, it wasn't just spending maybe an evening in jail or something. Your name was printed in the newspaper, as was your home address, right? So everyone in town knew what happened, and it basically changed your life forever. So at the time, Sarria had been studying education. He wanted to be a teacher, and with that being printed in the newspaper, that career was pretty much not going to happen for him. So he drops out of college. He comes to North Beach to drown his sorrows. He tries auditioning to be a female impersonator at Finocchio's, but is rejected. We'll talk about Finocchio's in a bit. And he winds up winning second place in a drag contest in Oakland, and that gives him finally the little pep he needs. He winds up going to the Black Cat Cafe just down the street here, and they hire him to be some entertainment, and the rest is history. Here's a couple looks inside the Black Cat. Outside, you can see maybe barely, the resolution's not great here, but we can see a little bit of a sign underneath the 710 address. That's a sign letting all of the sailors know they're not allowed in this particular establishment. The Navy would post some of these signs around different bars, ones that would serve alcohol too late, or ones who had characters or behaviors they didn't approve of. And then on the far right, we see Jose Sarria performing Faust, of all things, on the stage there. Jose Sarria had this great quote about the Black Cat. He said, "The Black Cat was a bohemian bar where women smoked in public, where people believed in free love, where there were artists wanting to talk about their artwork, where you could sit in a bar and play chess and cribbage, where you could go and have one glass of wine, where you would go and recite poetry. It was a bohemian bar. gay was never used. It was not a gay bar as we know gay bars today. One of my favorite stories about Jose Sarria is the police would frequently raid different bars, including the Black Cat during the 40s and 50s, and they would make up different reasons each time about what violation had happened or what went wrong here. And one of the common things for a while was that they were saying there's an intent to deceive. You're dressed as a woman, you're trying to fool innocent people into thinking you're of the opposite sex. And so Sarria created these buttons and had all the drag performers hide it under their coats, and so whenever they got arrested, they would just flash their pin and say, "Officer, we had no intent to deceive. In fact, we even announced it on our clothing here." Eventually, the pressure got hotter, and the Board of Equalization shut down the Black Cat and a couple of other bars at the time for being disorderly, and explicitly they called out a hangout for homosexuals. Now that's a different charge. That's not one of these trumped up fake charges. That's a brand new one, and they're saying the quiet part out loud. They're being very direct about why they want this bar down. And Saul Stoneman, who was straight but a wonderful ally, fought it. And he appealed and he lost, and he appealed and he lost, and he appealed and he lost. And he lost every single appeal until it got all the way to the California State Supreme Court, which resulted in a victory. They said this isn't a legitimate reason to shut down a bar just because they serve known homosexuals. And this forever changes what's allowable. We can now legally have gay bars that can't be harassed just for being gay. And it didn't stop other raids and didn't stop other kinds of pressure, but this was a landmark decision that forever changed things. Sadly, the Black Cat by this point had made lots of enemies, and by 1963, it shut down for good. For years, men would still come on the anniversary of its closure and lay giant piles of bouquets down at the front of the doors to honor all their memories there. Just around the corner was a little club called Opus One. It was founded by Donald Pippin, who would also go on to do Pocket Symphony here in San Francisco. And he had originally done music for a previous club, the Hungry Eye, that had been located there. They moved over to their Broadway location, but they still had an extra time on the lease, and so he convinced them to let him start a little club. It was supposed to be focused on classical music, but it attracted almost exclusively gay men, and he would often perform there. One of my favorite stories here is that the police were snooping around looking for trouble, and they hear this music coming from downstairs in the basement of the Sentinel building, which is where Opus One was, and they're convinced it's a party, and so they get their clubs out and they batter down the door and they go running down the stairs to charge in and break up this party, and it's just Donald Pippin by himself playing Beethoven on the piano. They're so moved by the music they stay for 2 whole movements before they move on. So I love this contrast, right? We have Sarria singing Faust on the stage. We have Donald Pippin quietly working in his more quiet bar, and both of them just, living out their truth in a different way. Donald Pippin later said, "I had acknowledged to myself that I was homosexual, but I had not, nor would have ever dreamed of, acknowledging it to anyone else." So we have different kinds of people all living this out. As we zoom out a little bit, a lot of these bars are on the tour. Next one, by the way, is this Saturday at 11 a.m. if you want to come along. But in the 1940s, I was surprised to see just how many gay and lesbian bars, mostly lesbian bars, existed. In the 1940s, at any given point, you had 3 to 7 lesbian bars on Broadway alone. And the reason why it was a higher index of lesbian versus gay is because gay men had their codes, their secret languages, they had bars they knew they could go to, they had cruising spots they know. And quite frankly, single men had more license at the time and more socially acceptable reasons to be out and about at a bar. Whereas women had a different world that they had to contend with. And so a lesbian bar was a safer place to go and avoid the speculation when they were out by themselves. They had private clubs, yeah, men had everything. Women had only a few places they could go. So one of the most famous of these lesbian spots was Mona's 440, founded by Mona Sargent, who happened to live in the Monkey Block. She wanted to create more of these bohemian bars to cater to her friends that she knew. And Mona's 440 was known as the place where girls will be boys, right? And it attracted a lot of what they call male impersonators, right? The flip of a drag queen or what would be a drag king today. One of the most famous stars to perform frequently at Mona's 440 was Gladys Bentley, who was openly bisexual, an amazing biography all by herself to learn more about her. But black and a blues singer and performing all over the country in these big venues, an amazing singer if you ever want to listen to some of her work. But she would perform regularly at Mona's, and Again, only performing in tuxedos. That was pretty common at this time. All the servers were dressed as men. And eventually on the streets up and down Broadway, you saw more and more women who only dressed as men. And it's hard to say nowadays, like how many of those people would identify as transgender versus just lesbians preferring to dress as men. That we lacked the vocabulary that we've created today to really articulate that. But certainly a surprising scene if you were here in the 1940s to see that much open behavior out in the streets. One of my favorite quotes here, Reba Hudson, who was a longtime patron of Mona's, says, the waitress was, she's talking about another waitress, another bar. The waitress was very worldly, wise, and cynical, and we were just a bunch of fresh-faced kids. We're wearing Levi's and cowboy boots, you know, dressed nicely and crisp and starched and everything. She said to us, "You kids don't belong here. You should go to Mona's 440. What's that like?" And she said, "You'll love it. Just take my word for it." So the next night we went to Mona's 440. Boy, you should have seen our faces. Here's all these women in tuxes, right? And they're entertaining and singing and working as waitresses. We continue to go there often. They made us feel very, very welcome. Another great thing I like here is Kay Scott, who ended up being a co-owner and helped push a lot of the entertainment, wrote a song herself around the 1940s, and it went, "There goes my gal, she's changed her name to Mike. There goes my gal, she's turned into a dyke. She cut her hair, she's wearing shirts and ties. She used to make men stare, now she gives the girls the eyes. I just can't figure out how it all began. There goes my gal, a lesbian." Again, if you'd told me this a couple years ago, I wouldn't have believed it happened in the 40s. Right across the street from Mona's was Chi-Chi Club, and this had a slightly different angle. It wasn't specifically catering to lesbian women, but because it was across the street from the most popular one, it ended up attracting a lot of that crowd. And interestingly enough, this is where Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin first landed from Seattle. They had heard about this amazing lesbian scene happening in North Beach, and they came very excited to see what it was, and they were not impressed. They described it as entertainment, not community. And this is a really important piece here because we start to see as this group is coming together that they're not all of the same mind. We have people coming into the scene now who want something more than just visibility, and they want something more than entertainment. They see a lot of straight people coming in as tourists, gawking at some of this, and they don't like the way that's being portrayed. They want to transform this, and they want to start mobilizing more for actual rights and for things to change. And Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin eventually found the Dollars of Bilitis, which is one of many homophile organizations that start to pop up in the late 50s here. Beverly Shaw is another famous performer who was at the Chi-Chi Club. She went on to found her own club down in LA. Finocchio's, perhaps one of the more famous ones here. Now, Finocchio's was definitely the biggest female impersonator club, one of the earliest ones, I think it founded in the 30s, right after Prohibition. Just a short list of some of the famous people who wound up here, attended here. Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Betty Davis, Marlena Dietrich, Lena Horne, Joan Crawford, Barbara Streisand, Mae West, Carol Channing, William Haynes, Elizabeth Taylor, Montgomery Clift, Roddy McDowell, Liza Minnelli, Cher, and Bette Midler, right? Just a small canon. And when it closed in 1999, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, our local poet, says, "What a drag." One of the most interesting things about Finocchio's is it maintained a tradition in the beginning, at least, where they weren't paid the entertainers and the entertainers who also acted as waitresses weren't paid an hourly wage. They were paid based on commission of how many drinks they sold. That became illegal because it was associated with a lot of the sex work that was happening. But they tried to keep it going a little bit longer before they got shut down for it. And eventually they switched to a model where there was an hourly wage, but there was still a waiter who separately would collect a tip from you if you wanted to go on a date with one of the ladies. The minimum was $5. If you gave $1, your message was never getting back to her. But if you gave $5, it would get to her, and that usually insinuated you were ready to pay for at least $50 of a date when you went and hung out with her. Catty corner of this, where the Garden of Eden is today, almost on the corner, was Tommy's Place, which connected back through to what is now Specs. Which at that time was called 12 Adler. And it was run by Tommy Vasu, who's a fascinating character. I actually want to continue researching more about her. She's interesting. She created this bar, and this marks a change, right? It's not Mona who's straight creating a bar. It's not Saul Stallman who's straight and has a gay bar. This is finally a lesbian creating her own lesbian bar in space. And what's fascinating is she takes the Broadway-facing area, and she does what Mona's doing, where she makes it very much a show so that straight tourists come in and spend lots of money and are fascinated fascinated to see people in different gender clothing. And then with 12 Adler, Specs today, behind it is more of a true local lesbian bar. And so straight people would come in and they would look at the show, and then they'd kind of peek back and see real couples meeting and having drinks together. Sadly, Tommy Vasu kind of ran with rougher crowds. She was falling in love all the time with women who had drug problems and other issues. And around the 50s here is when we start to see the tide turn from that golden era of a dozen lesbian bars on Broadway. We start to see the Lavender Scare and Hoover's FBI start to really put pressure socially on everyone to push back on the growing homosexual population. And eventually there's a staged raid of Tommy's place. They find drugs allegedly under the sink in there, which a lot of locals questioned. They said, if you were doing drugs, why would you do it there? It's like doing it in Times Square. There's so many other places you could do that. Doesn't make as much sense. But regardless, it happened to interestingly coincide with a Senate hearing that was happening that same morning, and they used that raid as proof that there's all these drugs mixed in with the homosexuals in these bars. And they made an example of Tommy's place and eventually shut it down. Tommy eventually, because of these women she was falling in love with and trying to help out, ends up going to jail for drug possession eventually a few years later, and then is sadly murdered upon her exit from prison. The last one I want to talk about here is Miss Smith's Tea Room, which served everything except tea. And this marks a shift, but now we're into the later 50s here, and again, the Red Scare has shut down a lot of the glory days of this, and these sort of dinner clubs were a lot more private, and they weren't as open about it. And at this point, you also have women starting to build careers where they care a lot more, and they have a lot more at risk of what would happen if they were ever found out or that was exposed. So going to these dinner clubs was really interesting. You had to be a little bit in the know of which ones were which, and the hostesses up front were kind of the bouncers. They were the gatekeepers, keeping everyone's reputation safe inside. And they would know how to kind of pick out people who would probably be okay with it, or if it was a bunch of rowdy boys, knew how to deflect them and get them to go to another bar. A fascinating time where things were kind of open, but not really. And like I said, at this time, you also see the rise of homophile organizations. You have the Mattachine Society for Men, which starts in LA and moves up to San Francisco, and you have the Daughters of Bilitis, which started here in San Francisco. And what's starting to happen is there's a bit of class divide. There's the bar gays who are having to suffer through the raids, who are fighting for their spaces, and who are a bit more radical in their agenda. And then you have the slightly more elitist, the more educated, the more wealthy homophile organizations who are trying to legitimize homosexuality in the eyes of the rest of the public and want a tamer, moderate view of homosexuality. And this divide starts to grow. By the 70s and 80s, we really see it take on an even bigger spread, where there are deep rifts in what the gay rights agenda should be. Whether or not it should be about gay marriage, trying to create an image that is more white and male and fits in with some of the stereotypes of heteronormative culture, or whether or not it's the total abolition of sexual norms and relationships, right? And generally, we see a much better representation of people of color still with some of the gay liberation and more radical movement in the bars versus the slightly tamer version we saw from homophile organizations. And so that is where the story should really start when we start to talk about Pride leading up to Harvey Milk and the Castro. So a couple final thoughts I'll leave you with here. First, go back to Jose Sarria. We left him singing on the stage, but he goes on to do amazing things. In 1961, he's the first openly gay man to run for elected office. He's a full decade ahead of Harvey Milk. He loses, but he's able to get about 6,000 votes, which forever changes San Francisco local politics, proving that there is a gay voting bloc and that this is a community you need to cater to if you want to be elected again in the city. He also goes on to found the Imperial Court System, which is a huge philanthropic organization still in existence today. He was announced the very first queen of this system and then crowned herself empress. And now we have every year a new empress who goes on to do fundraising events all around the city, but each city has their own. This was huge, and when AIDS finally struck in the 80s, this group was taking donations from bars so that they could pay for the rent of people who were too sick to work anymore. It was an amazing institution that Jose Sarria started almost casually on the side with all the other things that was going on. something else I was going to say about that. I'll come back to it. Between 2007 and 2019, more than a third of America's gay bars have closed. There's definitely a shift in where communities like this are trying to meet and how they connect together. None of the ones, sadly, that I showed you today remain at all. Their buildings are largely still there. Some of them are still kinds of bars. Actually, only one of them that I know of is still a bar. And on the tour, we end there. But yeah, we've sadly lost a lot of this. And it raises a lot of questions in the gay community is, are we evolving beyond, beyond the need for these bars? Or are we losing something really special? Is our community connected to these spaces? And is it an existential threat that we're losing them? One of my favorite quotes on this subject is from the author Jeremy Atherton Lynn, who wrote the book Gay Bar, Why We Went Out. He says, identity is articulated through the places we occupy, but both are constantly changing. If you'd like to read more about this topic, I heavily sourced this amazing book by Nan Ella Boyd, who is also an instructor here in San Francisco, a professor. It's called Wide Open Town, A History of Queer San Francisco to 1965. And I'd just like to end by giving a big thank you to the San Francisco Historical Society and the GLBT Historical Society, both of whom, through their archives and support, have really made this tour possible. So thank you so much. I think we're going to get a microphone set up and then we'll start. And I can repeat the questions too to make sure it's captured on the stream.
Sure. Jack Ryder, I just wanted to thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
If you've ever been by 710 where the Black Cat is,
yeah.
John Newmeyer is the one that commissioned the plaque that's in the sidewalk.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
About the history. Also, there's an amazing exhibit down at 401 Van Ness on 30-year retrospective on Winnie the Moore, if anyone wants to.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, yes, yes, I've seen all the posters for it.
It's a very cool exhibit.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's also a small statue or plaque for Jose Sarrio over at the Castro Library in a small alley that's named after him, but if I have it my way, I'm going to get more.
Yeah, I think the GLBT Historical Society, Roberto is the new director.
Yes, yes.
We have more input. Please come forward.
You explained that because of the population at the time, excuse me, the location of these bars, can you give us some idea of why it kind of moved away from the North Beach area?
Yeah, the question was, why did it move away from the North Beach area? It happened over time, and it also happened over generations, but essentially part of it was the Lavender Scare and this kind of last push of the anti-vice movement that was really focused just on the Barbary Coast neighborhood, which had by this point built quite a salacious reputation, right? So in the 50s, you start to see this disbursement. You see gay bars opening up in the Tenderloin. You eventually see more in Soma. There's a lot on Polk Street is a huge avenue for it. Before the 70s, it finally kind of reboots in the Castro with a kind of specific reason why it wants to own a specific neighborhood. But it was slow, and part of it was generational around the 50s of people wanting to reinvent and start over somewhere else.
Yeah, as a young man, I remember the Black Cat, and being a straight guy in San Francisco, particularly Halloween night, we'd go down to look at the people and the outfits and the costumes. And as I recall, not just Halloween, but they weren't really hassled by the police over that period of time. Do I recall correctly?
Well, there certainly were a couple of raids, and the Black Cat was part of a series of raids. Sorry, the question was the Black Cat given a lot of difficulty? Would this have been like late 50s or early 60s, do you know?
Yeah, late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah, so that would have been towards the end of the time. But yeah, it was raided at least 3 times.
Mention when it closed down.
It closed in 63. So,
63.
yeah, so it, and I know at least 3 or 4 times it was raided in the 50s by the police, usually as part of stings at several bars all at once. Again, when these sometimes would happen, it was sometimes coincided with like either a police chief that wants to look like they're cracking down on these sorts of things, or a push to show how spread it is to cause a little bit of moral panic and get people more angry about these things. But that said, I think they were smart about when they chose to do it, right? If there was a big Halloween celebration that happened every year, they didn't want to cause a riot, they probably wouldn't have picked that night necessarily. Although, Nana Ella Milliboy's book ends in 1965 because the police do raid a New Year's party that's well attended by gay people with that agenda, and it forever changes the landscape. Things become much more aggressive and politically organized after that moment. So it might have been the police picking and choosing their nights on when to do that.
Let's do questions so that you ask and you repeat.
Sure.
I'm curious, in your tour, do you talk about, maybe this is pre-prohibition or after, but in New York and London, a lot of the people met underground.
Yeah.
And we have some of those buildings where they discovered tunnels, and do you know a lot about, do you cover a lot about that?
Oh, I haven't heard much about tunnels. And I actually need to brush up more on the stories in New York, because I know that's a great contrast point that really shows the differences. But I know that in general, from what I've read, you know, San Francisco was always a little bit more of a tolerant city and a little bit more of an open city. You know, we're at the edge of control for what was the Spanish Empire, the edge of control for the Mexican Empire, the edge of control for the United States, the edge of control for how far the Russians went, right? And so from the beginning, there's this early culture where this is a bit of a lack of authority in San Francisco, and maybe that created a different mindset where there wasn't quite the desire to burrow in order to meet, but where it was more, slightly more open.
We didn't have a subway system at the time. Other questions? Jack.
John, this is just more of a comment, and it's probably going to come as a shock to some people, I don't know, but John and I had him in school. We got to teach together, got to know each other much later. We came up roughly at the same time. My parents had a business in North Beach. I knew Tommy was transgender when I was 12 years old, because she was a customer of ours and she was a friend of my mom's, and my mother just flat out explained it to me. Now for an Italian kid, you know, that's kind of progressive. I have, John was kind of raised in the other Richmond district out of the city, and there wasn't much going on out there. And I know a lot of my friends personally they didn't understand it, they were kind of shocked. I just kind of, it was there. And I know that there were stories firsthand because they were friends of the family. I know a woman who was a friend of my mother's who got arrested, and they moved it around the court system until they found the judge who slapped her on her hand. This was in the 50s. But just like the issue...
Jack, explain why she got busted.
She was dancing.
Dancing with?
Another woman in a bar, and the deal was the bar got cited because it didn't have a dance license, and they got hassled for something else. And these papers were kept in my mother's safe.
Wow.
in our real estate office. And when my mom died at age 90-something, I was cleaning the place out, and I found these papers. And I sat there and I started to look at them, and they brought back some kind of memories that I remembered. So some of it was just a matter of, I think, of attitude or where you were born. That said, other vices from San Francisco, North Beach, Barbary Coast, down there, moved out. There is a lady that just 3 years ago left 24th and Fulton to go live in Petaluma to take care of her mother. She was a working girl. She just left down around here to go out there because she could live in a nice apartment house and not be bothered, and the guys from downtown could take the 5 McAllister and go out at lunchtime and go back home. So the vice didn't go away. It just, what happened was, I know a good friend who came out to me early in life, he was gay. He just wanted to live someplace other than even the Castro. He just wanted to live a more normal life out of the limelight. He wanted to just be able to live like a person and be accepted. So there was a lot of that, and it was maybe closeted or maybe a little bit quiet or whatever it is. So that's part of it, because at age 13, I remember having a birthday party, going into one of the places on the Barbary Coast, and a rush to get these 13-year-old horny boys out of the place, you know, as the women were revealing. So I think the part of the city you lived in, people who lived in North Beach, Russian Hill, Telegraph Hill, most of them just didn't give a damn about it. That was the way it was.
Yeah.
So I think some of this might have had to do with attitude.
Yeah.
But I think it had to do perhaps with where you lived in the city. I mean, I revealed to my cousins the other day, an Italian family everybody gets named after an aunt or an uncle. Somebody could figure out why one of these aunts, great aunts, never had anybody lived after them. I explained that she wasn't a great aunt, she was my other aunt's partner. And they said, oh, why? And I said, because the Catholic Church wouldn't let them get married. So, you know, bullshit answer like that. So I think a lot of this, Dianne Feinstein used to speak of John's when she was trying to get reelected. I think this is a cyclical thing. I think, generally speaking, as you know, I'm 79. I have never ever lived in a city where there's been more tolerance, acceptance, and oftentimes it's a political agenda. So, and frankly, where I grew up, most people didn't give a damn.
Yeah.
Maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. I was just going to make one mention, and that's everybody throws the term Barbary Coast. Barbary Coast was a moving target, and so there was times, for example, in 1914, where they just simply closed it down because they were afraid it would be distracting to people who were going to come to the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915. So it was that kind of a cycle of political pressure. And so it just moves someplace else. But you know, it doesn't change activity, it just changes the appearance of what was going on. So that's part of that story. So we're talking about the fact that certain parts in certain neighborhoods would change, and that's just the way it was. That's what they did with more notorious Barbary Coast.
I mean, there was never a Caribbean movement, people storming down the street, you know, with
Just squeeze that when you talk. You got it.
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I wanted to know when the area began to change and the design center became a relevant place in this area.
Yeah, so from what I know, this hasn't been the subject quite of most of my research, but I know that it was around the, excuse me, the 70s when the Castro was rising, that there was also the leather bar scene starting to happen in Soma. In some ways, it was a reaction to the personalities of Castro. There was this, what they called the Castro clone, a certain way of every man dressing the same way, very like particular scene aesthetically. And the leather bar scene was kind of an antithesis to that, much more rough and tumble and aggressive motorcycle bars and whatnot happening over there. So from my understanding, that Soma and Castro were similar times, and they were almost in reaction to one another. Especially when you get into the 80s and the AIDS crisis, a lot of the more macho, butch looks of some of the leather bars in Soma were a reaction to a perception that gay men were physically weak or becoming ill, and so looking very buff and macho was a way of rejecting that narrative.
And there was a whole sweater bar on Alta Plaza.
Sweater bar I haven't heard of.
We have a question in the back, and I think that will call, well, we have one over here and over here. You're first, you're second.
Going back to Jose Sarria, he was the self-proclaimed widow of the Emperor Norton.
Yes.
In September 2013, he had a state funeral at Grace Cathedral.
Yes.
And I think there were like 24 motorcycle cops that drove everybody out to Colma.
Amazing.
And he's now buried next to the Emperor Norton.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, what a life, really. I mean, it's also interesting, too, that when he was helping Harvey Milk, one of the things he was helping get passed was removing any kind of laws that would prevent gay people from being teachers, right? Which was obviously a big part of his whole life story, right? He had to give up his dream of teaching because of that. So he truly saw maybe some of the biggest changes there from the kind of...
You have a question over here?
Sure. The prejudice he experienced to the rights he was able to win.
I wondered when you were doing your research, did you come across any mention of gayola? Because back in the 60s there were cases of police being paid off by gay bars, and so the news called bulletin, that ink newspaper that used to come out, referred to that as gayola.
Gayola I haven't heard of, but I will never forget it now. But I had heard, yeah, like I definitely hear in like the North, in New York scene, there was a lot more like mob influence. Like Stonewall was a mob-owned bar, and there was a lot more like payoffs of like the mob and also police on both sides of it to keep operating. That was less the case, I think, with San Francisco. It still happened, and there was always deep corruption going all the way up to the judge levels of a lot of this. But from my understanding, it was truly a cultural difference. It was not as much of a panic to most people. It tended to be new people to San Francisco that made a big panic about it. And the police raids tended to be more politically motivated and opportunistic given what was going on. But I'm sure there still were payoffs. I haven't heard that term before.
This was a case where the bars were paying off the police
Yeah.
to not harass them.
Yeah.
And this newspaper, the News Corps Bulletin, my memory is that it was pink, which was kind of funny. But that I saved for years the headlines that Gale the cops freed because I guess they were charged.
Oh, interesting.
They got away with it.
Yeah, I'll have to do some more research. Thank you for telling me about that.
I have a question here.
Oh yeah, John Newmeyer here. Sean, I've got some research that I did that I share with you. When I came here 55 years ago, I became aware and was invited to very grand parties. They were on the discreet side. I think of names like Bill Ewing and Dr. Fred Hudson. I have names from further back, but I was aware of these parties, which were maybe at Christmas time or whatever, had been going on for some time. So there had been a culture of gay gentlemen, if you will.
Are you saying house parties or are these at bar parties?
House parties. Oh,
House
yeah.
parties.
That evolved into a kind of network that provided men who could ask for money when that was needed, say for the first campaigns in the early 70s, the Harvey Milk era, and later on for the fight against AIDS. So it was a network of men who could be counted on to be gentlemen who give some money.
Interesting.
To a cause.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
I'll share that with you.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that.
All right, if you have other questions, bring them up to Shawn, and we'll call this an evening. Hope to see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you all.